Hey guys, today I'm going to be doing a book review for you on The Dirt by Motley Crue. This is one of my absolute favorite rock and roll books that I've read. I've read several of them. One of the things that I really like about this book is that it gives you each band member's perspective, whereas a lot of autobiographies don't really do that. They just give you one person's perspective and have one person writing it. So that is really cool and really interesting to hear the different point of views, sometimes on the same thing that happened, but different people see them differently, perceive them differently, right? So it starts out, Nicky writes a lot at the beginning. He gives you a lot of background on his childhood, which is interesting. It gives you that perspective of where he's coming from. They all, I don't remember Mick talking too much about his childhood, but Tommy and Vince also talk about their childhood a little bit and experiences that they had, and kind of gives you an idea of where they're coming from and why they did some of the crazy things that they did. But Nicky moved around a lot. He didn't really, his father was never there. Father left him. Mother was kind of a wild child. So his grandparents took care of him a lot. And so it kind of gives you an idea of where kind of all his anger and father issues and different things like that, different issues come from. So that's interesting. Then it gets into, of course, their beginning climb, trying to make it. They got to a point where they would sell out the whiskey and they thought they had made it, but obviously they hadn't. They didn't have a record deal. They tried to get a record deal. They couldn't get one. So they made their own label, Leather Records, and they put out Too Fast for Love actually on their own, recorded in 3 days, found the cheapest studio they could find to record it in, and ended up finding a distributor and sold 20,000 albums on their own, which is pretty cool. Then they talk about the US Festival and how that really helped them gain a lot of fans because they played for so many people. I was trying to find the number. I couldn't find it. It's probably in here somewhere, but there's a picture of the crowd. That many people, okay? So that really helped them out a lot on their climb to get to where they were trying to go. Then they toured with Kiss for a little bit, and then they toured with Ozzy. And of all the crazy things that Motley Crue has done, Nikki Sixx was actually shocked by some of the things that Ozzy did, like the story about how he bends over on the sidewalk and just snorts a bunch of ants. This is really disgusting, but he actually pees on the sidewalk and licks up his own pee, then challenges Nicky, basically peer pressures Nicky into doing the same thing. So Nicky pees, and before Nicky's able to lick up his own pee, thankfully, Ozzy licks it up for him. So it's crazy, it's shocking. There's some crazy detailed stories in here. Also, I think it speaks to the power of addiction, and I want to read this quote, not to shock you, but to, as if the other story didn't shock you already if you hadn't heard it, right? But to speak to the power of addiction, quote, "My veins were collapsing and I would scour my body to find fresh ones on my legs, my feet, my hands, my neck, and when the veins everywhere else had dried out, my dick." End quote. And that's a quote from Nicky. And of course it talks about not only that, but how he ODs. The one time he ODs, and what does he do? As soon as he gets out of the hospital, he goes and scores more heroin and does more heroin. So, of course, there's the parts about all the crazy relationships with all the girlfriends, the wives, the celebrity marriages, like with Tommy Lee and Heather Locklear, and him and Pamela Anderson. It talks about, which is interesting, is this the part? Yeah, this is the part. They kind of break down the grind of the music business for you, which I think is really interesting, especially if you're a musician, and kind of the different tiers and the different levels of the music business. And then, of course, it talks about, there's a chapter or a couple chapters by John Corabi, who sang for them for a while, and you just feel so horrible for him and everything he went through. And there was a quote in here, and I was trying to find it, but I didn't find it. But basically, I think it's at the end of his chapters, he just says, I wish I had had the balls to tell them, just make up your freaking minds. Because he would, that, I think the band kind of lost their direction at that point, right? I mean, anybody who was a Crue fan, I know I didn't like those albums. It just wasn't Motley Crue. It's not that the singer wasn't good or anything. It just wasn't Motley Crue. And so when they were in the studio, it was kind of like Mickey and Tommy pulling them in different directions, and the producer, and it just wasn't unified, So it was just kind of scattered and all over the place. So that drove him crazy. There's a chapter on, Vince's daughter, Skylar, and his 4-year-old daughter, and how she got cancer. And that chapter is so heartbreaking. I remember the first time that I read this book, I reread it for this review and in anticipation of the movie that's coming out. I'm so excited. But the first time I read this book, the chapter on his daughter, he goes through details on her illness and her being in the hospital and going through all the treatments and the surgeries, and I welled up with tears when I read it. And I remember I was downstairs with like family members during the holidays or something, and I actually had to go upstairs and lock myself in a room alone and just cry as I read this chapter. It's just so heartbreaking. No one should ever have to bury a child, especially a 4-year-old child, or any child for that matter. It's just so heartbreaking. And then I want to end it on, so then after, the John Corabi era, if you will, the label, people at the label and want to get Vince back in the band because it just wasn't Motley Crue without him. And of course, eventually he comes back. He's pissed at Tommy and Nikki. Feels like Tommy was being a jerk. They were all trying to be sober. They were on tour. They were trying to be sober. And I got to read you these couple of quotes because I just think they're hilarious. So they're trying to be sober, not drink, or do any drugs, obviously. And there's this quote from Vince. He says, quote, I like to have a cocktail every now and then, and I don't like them to cost $25,000 each. End quote. So they were fining themselves whenever they drink, fining themselves $25,000 in order to give them incentive to not drink. So anyway, they catch up. Nikki finds out that Vince has gone out for some drinks after one of the shows or whatever. He gets ticked at him. He socks him. Vince is ticked off. He quits the band, and then he goes to a pilot friend's hotel a couple of blocks away, and he tells him, let's go back to LA. And I want to read this paragraph to you and end it on this because it's kind of hilarious, even though I like that he sees the humor in it. I like to see humor in things, even though it's not the best situation. This is Vince writing, quote, we took a cab to the airport and found the whole band in the waiting area, assuming that somehow everything was okay, that we had gotten the anger out of our system, and were going to press on to Boise. The pilot and I walked past them. Nikki, Mick, and Tommy picked up their bags to follow. Wait right here, I told them. Then I boarded the plane, shut the door, sat down next to the window, and flipped them off. It was my greatest performance on the whole tour. End quote. I laughed out loud when I read that. So anyway, this is a great book. I can only give you so much. I don't want to, read the whole book to you. Obviously, it's just a review. It's a long review. It's a great book. It has so many more details in it. I just shared a few and just kind of went through it a little bit with you. There's so much more. Definitely, highly recommend it. I give it 5 out of 5 skulls. The Dirt by Motley Crue.